Vienna, 1904. Just as the cathedral bells tolled midnight and the Danube winds rattled the shutters along Kohlmarkt, Tamsin Elwood moved quickly through the side entrance of the Hofburg Palace, a bundle of hemmed lace and pearl-threaded silk tucked beneath her shawl. Her boots were damp from the evening rain, and the scent of coal smoke clung to her braid. She shouldn't have been here not alone, not so late, but the Archduchess's gown had torn during the waltz rehearsal, and the prince himself had sent word for a seamstress who could mend it by morning. She'd expected a frazzled maid, maybe a footman. Not him. "Are you the one they call the thread whisperer?" His voice came from behind a column, smooth and low. Tamsin turned and nearly dropped the gown. He was taller than she imagined, young, no older than 21, with dark blonde hair curled just above his collar and eyes the color of storm-washed slate. His uniform was half undone, the ceremonial jacket slung over one shoulder, the sash of the Order of the Golden Fleece catching the moonlight. "Yes, Your Highness," Tamsin said, her voice steady though her heart kicked against her ribs. "I was told the Archduchess's bodice tore." "She did that herself, dancing too close to the fire," he said, stepping forward. "I'm Nikolaus Callahan." Tamsin blinked. Princes didn't introduce themselves. They didn't wait in corridors for seamstresses. And they certainly didn't smile like that, like they'd been waiting for a reason to breathe differently. "I'll need a quiet place to work," she said, lifting the gown. "And a full lamp. I can't stitch shadows." He nodded and led her through a narrow corridor, past a marble bust of Empress Elizabeth, into a drawing room with velvet armchairs and a harp tucked beside the window. He lit a lamp with one practiced flick and gestured to the chaise. "You may work here. I'll stay." "You don't need to." "I want to." Tamsin knelt beside the chaise and unwrapped the gown. The bodice was gaping, the silk warped. She threaded her needle in silence, aware of his gaze as keenly as if it were a hand pressed to her back. "You're American," he said after a pause. "My father was," she replied. "He taught me to sew before he passed. My mother's Viennese." "And you live in the Neubau Quarter?" She nodded, surprised. "How do you know that?" "I've seen your work. My cousin's wedding veil. That was yours. I sold that piece through Madame Bauer's shop. I didn't know it reached the court." He moved closer, kneeling to match her eye level. "It did. It was perfect, like frost spun into thread." Tamsin didn't blush easily, but now her face burned. "I don't belong here," she said, voice quiet. "And you shouldn't be alone with me. Not after midnight. Not ever." Nikolaus tilted his head. "I was alone until now." She tried to return to her stitching, but her hands trembled. He noticed. "May I?" he asked, reaching out not to touch her, but to hold the edge of the fabric taut. She nodded. Their hands didn't touch, not yet, but the space between them narrowed. "You don't speak like the others in court," she said, working the needle through a mauve seam. "You're not." "Hullo. My mother was Irish. She used to sing in the kitchens and let me eat with the stable boys." His mouth twisted slightly. "That's not something I'm supposed to remember." Tamsin glanced at him. "But you do." "I remember everything." A guard knocked at the far door. Nikolaus stood swiftly and opened it only a crack. "She's still working," he said. "Tell the Archduchess I'll bring the gown before breakfast." The guard left without a word. He returned to her side. "How long will it take?" 20 more minutes. "Then I'll wait 20 more years, if you ask." Tamsin looked up, startled. "I don't say things I don't mean," he added softer now. She bent her head, pretending to focus on the needle, but her pulse fluttered in her throat. When the last stitch was tied, she folded the gown carefully and stood. "It's ready." He took the gown, but his gaze never left her face. "Walk with me." "I can't." "You can," he interrupted. "No one will stop you if you're with me." The corridor was quiet as they moved side by side. Their hands brushed once. She didn't pull away. Nikolaus stopped near a tall window. The moon was high, silvering the city. "I'm to be engaged by summer," he said. "To a Bavarian princess I've never met." Tamsin looked at him. "Then this is foolish." "Yes." "And dangerous." "Also yes." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded square of parchment. "But if you ever want to see the gardens at night, I walk them most Thursdays. After the orchestra stops." She didn't take the note, but she didn't refuse it either. A week passed. On a Thursday, after the last note of Strauss faded beyond the palace gates, Tamsin found herself walking the edge of the Hofburg's east garden. Her borrowed shawl barely shielded her from the wind. Then she saw him waiting beneath the linden tree, a single lantern at his feet. "You came," he said. "I shouldn't have. But you did." Nikolaus offered his arm. She hesitated, then took it. They walked slowly, the gravel shifting underfoot. He told her about his tutor, a Hungarian exile who taught him forbidden poetry. She told him about her tiny workshop above the copper shop, how she dreamed of opening her own salon one day. "You could," he said. "You will." They stopped near the oldest fountain. He turned to face her. "I want to kiss you," he said. Her breath caught. "Don't." "I won't. Not unless you ask." She looked up at him, the prince, with laughter in his eyes, sorrow in his voice, and a quiet rebellion in his heart. "Then wait," she whispered. "Wait for me." He nodded. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But that night, under the moonlight, something shifted. A seam pulled. A heart opened. And neither of them would ever be the same again. The scent of pressed lavender clung to the corridors of the Hofburg's southern wing, where the tailoring commissions were kept in a narrow antechamber overlooking the Augustinian cloister. Tamsin sat cross-legged on the floor, threading a fine silver wire through a bodice loop. Her fingers moved with precision, but her thoughts wandered beyond the palace walls, through moonlit gardens, and toward a voice that had not left her since that Thursday night. A low knock stirred her. Not at the door, too familiar for that. At the window. She rose, crossed the room cautiously, and lifted the latch. A small folded paper had been tucked between the frame and the sill, held in place with a pressed sprig of myrtle. She unfolded it under the lamplight. The writing was tight, deliberate, and unmistakably his. She did not smile. Instead, she folded the note into her sleeve and returned to the bodice. The touch of his words on paper had drawn her breath shallow, but she stitched in silence. When the gown was finished, she wrapped it in muslin and descended the servants' staircase, her mind balancing between restraint and ache. Down the back corridor, she passed a footman polishing a brass handle. He didn't look up. Few did. She reached the receiving room and laid the gown on the carved oak table. "Tamsin Elwood?" She turned. The voice belonged to a woman, close in age, with light hair pinned into a coronet braid and a badge of the imperial household on her lapel. "I'm Fräulein Dürer. I oversee the Archduchess's wardrobe. She's requested your presence for a fitting tomorrow afternoon." She looked Tamsin over, not with disdain, but a kind of curiosity. "You work quickly." Tamsin nodded. "I'll be here." "No," said Fräulein Dürer, adjusting the cuffs of her jacket. "She wants you at the Schönbrunn apartments. Bring your smallest needles. She favors delicate seams." As she turned to leave, Fräulein Dürer hesitated. "The Archduchess is not the only one who's noticed your work." Tamsin's heart stumbled, but she said nothing. That night, she walked home past the wine cellars and the shuttered cafes near Mariahilfer Strasse. Her flat was quiet, the lamp still lit from morning. On the work table lay the next project, a baptismal robe for a baron's daughter, lacework finer than breath. She sat, drew the pattern book toward her, and let herself imagine the palace gardens again. The Schönbrunn apartments smelled of lemon oil and old marzipan. Gilt-framed portraits stared down from every wall, and the rugs bore centuries of polished footsteps. Tamsin stood quietly in the dressing room, pins in her cuff, as the Archduchess examined herself in a triptych mirror. "I want the neckline changed," the Archduchess said, plucking at the tool. "It makes my shoulders look provincial." Tamsin nodded and began marking the fabric with chalk, careful not to press too hard. "You're not from court," the Archduchess said suddenly, watching her through the mirror. "But you're not like the others." "I only go where I'm asked," Tamsin replied. The Archduchess tilted her head. "And if the wrong man were to ask?" Tamsin stood, chalk still in hand. "I don't take requests that would dishonor your household." The Archduchess laughed, not cruelly, but with a kind of resigned amusement. "Then you'll have no shortage of refusals, Fräulein Elwood." The fitting ended without further exchange. Tamsin packed her tools neatly, the silence between them as poised and brittle as spun glass. Outside, the air was crisp. A carriage waited at the end of the gravel path, its door unlatched. A footman gestured. "The prince requests your company." A brief matter. She hesitated, then stepped in. Inside, Nikolaus sat across from her, gloves in his lap. He looked tired, not from sleep, but from the effort of appearing untouched by anything. "I didn't know they'd summon you," he said. "You didn't arrange it?" "No," he said, "but I wanted to see you." The carriage began moving, slow and quiet through the early twilight. "I don't know what this is," she said. "I steady. And I don't know what you expect from me." "I expect nothing." He leaned forward slightly. "But I hope for everything." She looked away, out the window. "You're expected to marry someone with a title, a dowry, a name carved into marble." "I'm expected to do many things," he said. "But I've begun to question whose expectations matter." The carriage stopped at the end of a narrow lane. He reached for the door, then paused. "There's an artist's gallery opening next week. Off Kartnerstrasse. No court officials, no titles. Just music and oil on canvas. And if I'm seen?" "You won't be," he said. "But if you are, tell them you came for the paintings." She stepped out without answering. But that night, she opened the pressed myrtle sprig from the note, laid it between the pages of her pattern book, and circled the date of the gallery in ink. Not a promise. Not yet. But a beginning. The gallery above the apothecary on Kartnerstrasse was lit only by oil lamps set deep in niches, their glow throwing long shadows across the wooden floorboards. Tamsin stepped inside alone, her gloves still damp from the sleet outside. Her dress was slate-colored wool modest, with a high collar and a single row of carved mother-of-pearl buttons. She had chosen it carefully, neither too fine nor too plain, the kind of garment that drew no attention in a room full of strangers. She moved slowly, pretending to study the painting's mostly landscapes, Tyrolean hills in spring, a charcoal study of a storm over Lake Neusiedl, but her eyes searched for him. Every step closer to the back room tugged at her chest, tight and uncertain. A string quartet played a soft etude beside the hearth. Beyond them, near a panel of snow-dusted windows, Nikolaus stood with his hands behind his back, listening to a woman describe the difference between lapis and ultramarine. His posture was precise but relaxed, the set of his mouth unreadable. Tamsin stayed back, letting the moment stretch. Then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, he turned. He didn't smile. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped away from the conversation. "You found it," he said when they met near a painting of a rain-soaked orchard. "I walked past it twice. The sign's nearly illegible." "On purpose," he said, glancing at the crooked brass placard above the door. "The artist prefers patrons who will look for beauty without being told where to find it." Tamsin turned toward the painting. The orchard glistened with rain, but the trees were bare, their branches fragile and reaching. "It looks cold." It was painted the day after his wife left him. She took the children. He never saw them again. She folded her arms. "Then it's not about beauty at all." "No," Nikolaus said. "It's about what's left behind." They stood in silence, the music threading between them. He didn't reach for her. She didn't lean closer. But the nearness was enough. "I've been offered a commission," she said, keeping her eyes on the painting. "A trousseau. For a wedding in Krakow. A minor countess, but her dowry stretches to the Carpathians." He didn't answer right away. "Would you go?" "I haven't decided." He stepped slightly to her left, so he could see her face more clearly without turning. "What would keep you here?" "I'd have to be needed," she said, voice low. "Not just wanted." Nikolaus looked straight ahead. "My father's begun to involve me in military briefings. They send me reports from Bosnia now. Casualty counts. Rail logistics. I'm expected to have opinions." "Do you?" "Only questions." Tamsin studied the lines of his profile, the stillness in his brow, the way his jaw clenched at the word expected. He was not a man untroubled by privilege. A man passed close behind them, brushing Tamsin's shoulder. She stepped instinctively closer to Nikolaus. He didn't move away. "I saw the Archduchess again," he said quietly. "She asked whether I'd chosen a design for the engagement announcement." She turned her head. "And have you?" I told her I hadn't seen anything that felt honest. Tamsin's gaze dropped to the floor. "You're not free to be honest." "No," he said, "but neither am I bound to lie." The quartet shifted to a mazurka, its rhythm light and quick. The gallery swelled with motion. A few couples began to dance in the open space between the easels and the fireplace. Nikolaus looked toward the center, then to her. "One piece," he said, offering his hand. "Just to see if the floor holds." She hesitated. Then, with a breath so quiet it barely stirred her scarf, she placed her hand in his. They walked into the small circle of dancers. He held her with the restraint of a man trained never to want aloud. She matched his steps precisely, the turns and passes as smooth as a whisper. No one spoke their names. No one questioned their pairing. In that room, among strangers and brushstrokes, their silence was permitted. When the mazurka ended, he released her hand slowly. "Will you come to the winter fair?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the applause. "It's 3 days from now. In the courtyard behind the stables. I'll be there at dusk." Tamsin lifted her chin. "I'll think about it." He stepped back, nodded once, and disappeared into the crowd without another word. That night, as she unpinned her hair in the silence of her flat, she found the scent of turpentine still clinging to the folds of her dress. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't reach for her thimbles or thread. She simply sat, bare feet on the cold floor, and let the memory of his hand in hers warm the quiet. Snow had settled along the eaves of the Hofburg's outer stables by the time Tamsin arrived, her boots crunching softly against the packed slush. The winter fair had filled the courtyard with the scent of roasted chestnuts and pine tar, and the gentle clang of blacksmiths demonstrating their craft echoed faintly beneath the soft hum of laughter and distant sleigh bells. She kept her hands tucked into a muff lined with rabbit fur, borrowed from the widow upstairs who had once embroidered for the Tyrolean court. Her coat was plain, but freshly brushed, and a single jet brooch pinned at the collar was the only ornament she allowed herself. Nikolaus stood near a booth where wooden toys were being carved by hand. He was in civilian attire, his hat low over his brow, a scarf wound once around his neck in a manner that made him indistinguishable from any other well-bred young man in Vienna. She approached without pause. "You're late," he said, eyes flicking to hers. "I came when the light was softest." "That's what the painter said about the orchard," he murmured, stepping aside to let a woman with a fur-trimmed cape pass. "There's something I want to show you." They walked together past a line of booths selling sugared almonds and nutmeg soap, beyond the scent of mulled cider. At the edge of the fair, tucked between the cooper's tent and a modest shooting stall, was a small table with a velvet cloth and a lacquered box. "Open it," he said. Tamsin hesitated, then lifted the lid. A pair of gloves rested inside, hand-stitched from deep navy leather, lined with silk so fine it felt like breath. The stitching was precise, nearly invisible. She traced the edge of one thumb with the tip of her finger. "They were made by a cordwainer from Trieste," Nikolaus said. "He apprenticed under a man who once made gloves for the Empress." "I can't accept them." "You can't," he said, "because they're not a gift. They're a commission." She looked up sharply. "I want you to design a gown," he said. "Not for the Archduchess. Not for any engagement. For a woman attending a private concert at the Palais Wittgenstein next month. No embellishment. No crests. Just beauty undeniable and quiet." She watched him carefully. "What am I to think? That you're the only one I trust to make something worth remembering?" Tamsin didn't reply. Instead, she closed the box and folded her hands atop it. "Will she be there?" she asked. "No," he said. "But someone else will. Someone who's waded through silence and snow." A gust of wind stirred her coat hem. She lifted the gloves from the box and slipped them on. "They fit perfectly. I'll start this week." He nodded once, then stepped back as if to let the moment settle. "There's another reason I asked you here." She raised an eyebrow. "I spoke to my uncle," he said. "He oversees the cultural grants awarded to artisans outside the nobility. I gave him your name." Tamsin's shoulders tensed. "You went around me. I went because of you, not in place of you. I don't want to be someone's cause." "You're not," he said. "But the way you work how you see things deserves more than back corridors and borrowed lamplight." Her breath caught. She adjusted the gloves, focusing on the seams. "I'm not used to being seen," she said. "Then let that be your first commission," Nikolaus said. "Make something for the woman who wants to be seen." A boy passed between them selling dried apples, breaking the thread of silence. She didn't answer. Not then. But when Nikolaus turned to leave, she followed. They didn't touch. Not once. But as they walked beyond the fair, through a narrow passage where the snow had not yet been trampled, they left behind the noise, the scent of cinnamon, and the weight of what could not be said in public. And for the first time, the space between them held not just longing but intent.